Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to the Sabbat World's Crusade. Since we focused in on the war for Lyubov last time and the tragic fate of General Andreas Karnhide, a man that history would have a lot more to say about than his contemporaries did, and far more positive as well, we should now take a step back again, as the overall strategic situation of the Crusade has evolved quite a bit. There were dozens of other major and minor conflicts raging across the primary and secondary fronts at the same time as Lyubov. And many were equally as decisive. Some were far more disastrous, and in general, they would all begin to reveal a growing problem with the Crusade. We talked about, in the last episode, how the Adeptus Mechanicus attached to General Lyubov's task force were upset that the war had dragged on for far longer than they had been told it would, and that if they were going to be used, they should at least be used where there was the most glory to be had. This was by no stretch of the imagination a sentiment unique to the Adeptus Mechanicus. The war had been going on for far longer than anyone had been told to expect. And it in turn meant, of course, that the resources originally allocated to the Crusade had proven to be woefully inadequate. Largely, the Crusade's many backers had so far proven willing and able to continue to support the Crusade's endeavors, even under the new Warmaster Makaroth. But as the Warmaster became beleaguered yet again in another PR disaster, there were some that started to grumble about the continued expectations of yet more men, yet more materiel, yet more war machines, and yet more taxes levied upon the imperial populace to raise further forces. This inevitably meant that whilst the reinforcements were still arriving, they were growing more sparse, fewer and further between. And there were even the potential rumblings that they might begin to cease altogether, or at the very least be drastically reduced. This matter was further exacerbated by the Warmaster's decision to prosecute the war both against Anakwanar Sek and Urlok Gaur at the same time, as the Imperial Crusade now found itself faced with a massively wide and long front line, all of which needed to be manned and occupied, and not merely defensively, but offensively as well. The only way the Crusade could continue at this rate was to start raising fresh Imperial Guard regiments from the liberated worlds wherever possible. In many cases, the liberated worlds were more than eager to provide the Crusade with additional reinforcements to strike back against the Chaos Invader, those who had occupied their lands, ravaged their villages, and slaughtered so many of their friends and comrades. Some liberated worlds, like Verghast for example, were also able to provide industrial support. Obviously, they did not have access to the revered blueprints of the Adeptus Mechanicus, but they could still produce shells, ammunition, perhaps some power packs, or locally produced pieces of armor, APCs, and IFVs to be used by garrison forces. Probably not worthy of frontline operations, sure, but more than enough to keep the locals in check, those few who still had sympathies for the Chaos cause, that is. It may not have been much in the grand scale of things, but every little bit helped, as the Imperial Crusade was in danger of beginning to bleed to death. These fresh infusions of new men and materiel would stem the bleeding for now, but they brought with them new complications. See, for all of the enormosity of the Imperial Crusade, it was largely made up of smaller component parts. This, of course, is what General Andreas Karnhide had complained so loudly and vociferously about. He had been given an army of pieces and expected to make a whole for it. He had been given one regiment over there, another regiment over there, an armored formation, and an artillery regiment over here. Normally, most of these formations would have been operating fairly cohesively alongside one another for years and years and years, growing to know their quirks, their specialities, and their abilities. And normally as well, they would be operating under the same handful of generals, who would also grow to understand their strengths and their weaknesses. But when you have a crusade made up of thousands, if not tens of thousands of such regiments, and you are required to throw together a task force of significant size at a short notice, this gets complicated. And it wasn't just Karnhide who was beginning to see this challenge. As the total number of veteran regiments began to decrease, it became harder and harder to keep those who had gotten used to one another around one another. Because, of course, a blue war front blazes off over there, and reinforcements are needed. Okay, grab these regiments and send them over immediately. Other regiments were in desperate need for periods of rest and relaxation. Some regiments had taken absolute ferocious batterings, particularly during the early Chaos counter-invasions that had so very nearly decapitated the entire Crusade. They had to be pulled back and reinforced. Many had even taken enormous casualties in terms of tanks, artillery pieces, even just personal firearms. It would take months, on some occasions years, to refit these regiments to the point where they were once again fully combat effective. In the meantime, they would be taken off the line, and their other comrades might go on for a bit further and then be pulled back too. In essence, the Imperial Crusade had been a vast puzzle, where all of the various pieces had, to a greater or lesser degree, been able to have been grinded and pushed together into a largely cohesive whole. But now, due to the requirements of circumstance and simple reality, the puzzle piece was being torn apart and smashed to pieces. And it was beyond even the tremendous organizational capacity of Warmaster Makaroth to make sure that all of them fit smoothly back together again. This overall reduced the fighting abilities of the Imperial Crusade, and it was yet further reduced by the introduction of huge numbers of entirely green regiments, in many cases not even levied from planetary defense forces. Many of these regiments had been recruited, eagerly enough, given 6, 7, or 8 months of basic training, and then shipped off to fight chaos on the sharp end of things. I don't think I need to tell you how well that often worked out. I mean, it is challenge enough for a bunch of barely trained boys to march headfirst into machine guns. Imagine if the machine gun is also screaming at you whilst the little bullets fly laughing past your head. And seeing one of your comrades be struck by one of these bullets and not die immediately. A look of shock, surprise, and hope flashes across his face, right before his abdomen starts to bulge outward as the bullet, through warp nonsense, expands inside of his body, tearing him to little pieces as it rips and shreds every internal organ as blood vomits forth from his mouth. Yeah, it's a tough trial by fire. And in many cases, corralling these new regiments required a different style of leadership, often a very dangerous one. Take, for example, the battle for Taraga. Now, this happened in early 774, when the Anarch's armies had been largely shattered and was retreating before the advancing victorious armies of the Imperial Crusade. A large formation of enemy troops had been, in essence, trapped on the agri-world of Taraga, and a major Imperial victory was at hand. However, a large percentage of the Imperial army there was not of the stoutest caliber, quite a few fresh recruits, and thus the Fifth Army's commander, one Rudi Luskheim, thought it best to lead the assault with a little bit more personal panache than usual. Luskheim would lead the assault from dangerously close, particularly for the commander of an entire army front. But he was one of Makaroth's up-and-coming favorites, one of the rare ones to have been assigned to the second front. He was a clever commander, and had an instinctual understanding of the battlefield. Right here, he no doubt understood that the enemy was cornered, meaning you now had a vast collection of semi-professional, often dangerously professional in fact, chaos maniacs with their backs up against the wall, facing up against a Imperial guard force of a lot of recently elevated guardsmen. If the rat decided to bite, and they also often do when cornered, that could potentially lead to a major collapse amongst the less veteran elements of Luskheim's army, which could lead to a major disaster. To stiffen the resolve of the fresh recruits and to avoid this, he elected to lead the action up close. It was the correct decision by all accounts, but, of course, when you get close to the firing, sometimes the firing finds you. And that is exactly what happened here, as General Luskheim was killed by a rocket strike. That could very easily have led to an even greater disaster, but fortunately, Colonel Andred Cole, one of Luskheim's favorite commanders, was ready and able to step up, take charge, and prevent what could have very easily have been a complete collapse of the Imperial offensive on Taraga. Luckily, the Chaos Forces were not particularly well led, and did not manage to take advantage of the situation that they had created. In all due likelihood, they weren't even aware that they had, by, well, sheer accident practically, managed to kill the Imperial commander. So swift and so decisive was Andred Cole's takeover of command. A very near disaster, then, matched equally so by the real disasters, as this happened on other worlds. The planet of Vanthal, for example. The shattered remnants of Enoch Innocenti's forces had been thrown away in complete disarray after Herodor, and a huge number of them fell upon the twin worlds of Vanthal and Lysander. Now, this army was large, admittedly, and technically well supplied, but it was also expected to be leaderless, and probably in a complete panic after the death of Innocenti. Thus, their pursuit and eradication, which was left up to Marshal Gantz, was viewed as largely a formality. They were a horde of wild beasts that needed to be pursued, driven to ground, and executed. That was all. No big deal. And now that they'd stopped running, well, the most difficult challenge, hunting them down and cornering them, it had already been achieved. Marshal Gantz was no doubt thanking his lucky star as he rode down to the planet aboard one of the countless mass transports. It would not remain, however, a formality. Exactly what Luschenk had feared on Taraga now took place on Vanthal. As Marshal Gant's forces landed on the planet, they presumed that the enemy would be already defeated and would not be able to mount any serious opposition to them. Instead, the Chaos forces, the cornered rat, turned and bit. Assaulting and overrunning the landing zones, they inflicted enormous casualties on the Marshal's armies. Official accounts estimate that as many as 3 million guardsmen may have been killed in a single day. This could only have been possible, of course, due to a complete breakdown in organization, in the structure of Marshal Gantz's army, in the command systems, or in the cohesiveness of his guard formations. As the Chaos hordes ran rampant through their numbers. This was the single most expensive day for the Imperial Guard in the entirety of the Crusade. Worse even than the initial invasion of Balhat. Now, due to the sheer size of the pursuing force, and the absolute wild desperation with which the Chaos hordes threw themselves at it, caring not at all for their own casualties, they knew they were doomed. They were just going to take as many Imperials as they could down with them. Marshal Gantz eventually managed to regain control, and successfully conquered the planet. Heavy quotation mark on successfully. And Warmaster Makaroth agreed, as Marshal Gantz was stripped of his position, publicly chastised, and replaced. Which tells me, incidentally, that Marshal Gantz must have had a lot of friends in really high places, as normally the consequences for a cock-up of this scale and quality would be a firing squad. Fortunately, his replacement, that's starting to become a little bit of a theme here, isn't there, about commanders falling in battle, more or less honorably. Rand Hupert, a rare female Imperial Guard High Command officer, proved utterly capable of taking over his duties. In fact, she did a lot better than he did. Now, she was faced with weaker opposition, true, after the enormous slaughter fest of the first day of the war, but she also had a lot less resources with which to succeed. The remnants of the enemy had gone to ground in the Arctic areas of Vanthal, and needed to be winkled out with a fairly lengthy but decisive campaign of far northern warfare, where the terrain was as much of a danger to the attacker as the Chaos defenders were. She then also launched a blitzing and highly successful campaign on Lysander to take out the remnants of the Chaos forces. No doubt, Rand Hupert expected to receive ample plaudits for her achievements, but much like Andreas Carnhide, she too had been one of Slaydo's favoured few. And so, when the news of her successes came across Warmaster Makaroth's desk, particularly as they had come, not, through any error of hers, of course, but at the expense, nevertheless, at Marshal Gantz, well, her achievements were rewarded in reverse, as she was given garrison duty of the Can Nobilis system. And then, just as she thought she might see some action, well, she was diverted back to Balhat to be placed in the command reserves. She didn't actually make it back to proper active duty until 6 years later, in 780, when she was brought up to the primary front. Other conflicts were less flashpointy. Some particularly unfortunate planets remained battlegrounds for years, as one Imperial Guard force rolled over it, and then a Chaos force came over and took it back, and then the Imperium returned, and so on and so on. One of these worlds was Turnus, which remained a battleground for 4 years. And after it was all said and done, there were serious considerations to simply just abandoning the planet near entirely, as virtually all of its infrastructure, its industry, its habitable areas, and so on had been fought over again and again and again, to the point where there were nothing more than shattered, scattered, and burnt out wrecks. The only reason why the planet was not simply thrown away by both sides was because it sat on a key warp route. One of relatively few easily navigable and stable sections of warp to real space in the area, meaning that both the Imperium and Chaos desired it desperately to allow their own forces easy passage through the region. This was particularly important now that the Headwatt fleet activity had begun to pick up again. The enemy's raiders had previously been quite the hazard to the Imperium's overstretched supply lines, but during the massed Chaos counterattack, their raiding activity had dropped off drastically. In all due likelihood, the Vahedwak had simply been too busy moving the countless Chaos armies back and forth across the void to continue their harassment campaign of the Imperium's rearward lines. But now that they were no longer shuffling these enormous quantities of men and material around, they could return to other, more immediately profitable pursuits. The Imperium was not overjoyed by this, unsurprisingly so, as now, yet again, they needed to reassign Imperial Navy forces to guard against their predations. And the Vahedwak were getting ever more ambitious in their actions as well, clearly having been able to secure several key treaties with Chaos Archons and other warlords. They had gained access to significant ground forces, which they now used to raid outlying worlds, not merely just pouring down upon them in a sudden Blitz-style assault to retreat shortly thereafter, but actually launching assaults upon major population centers and fortified outposts, besieging them, defeating them, and raiding them systematically over a lengthy period of time. This would see yet further Imperial Guard forces reassigned from the vital front lines to, well, basically sit around on garrison duty, weakening the front line yet further, and diluting the real veteran Guard formations and forcing yet more green formations onto the line. This was yet further exacerbated in 775, with several major revolts breaking out in the Kulan sector. Now, some of you may remember that it was, of course, the Kulan Wars that brought Warmaster Slaydo to general recognition. This was the sector neighboring the Sabbat worlds, and had, early on, been the rock, the foundation upon which the Crusade was founded. It was the primary supplier of men and materiel to the Crusade. And, well, all of those demands, as we mentioned earlier, had been growing and growing and growing steadily, and the requirements placed upon the population equally so. Many worlds had food riots, or various industrial sabotage attempts, outright strikes, or even attempts at coups. There were even sedition attempts from some of the nobles of the various planets, who declared that the leaders of the Kulan sector were no longer acting in the sector's best interest, that it was bleeding the sector dry for a hopeless war in the Sabbat worlds, or at the very least they argued that support should be scaled down Clearly, a swift victory was already impossible, so what was the rush? Surely this war could be prosecuted more slowly, more gently upon the, to be fair, limited resources of the Kulan worlds. They too had just recently gone through a major war, and there were serious elements of unrest and insurrection brewing on those planets. If the Imperium didn't want to lose one sector to regain another, it needed to back off, they argued. Now, these insurrections were largely cracked down upon in a few years, various demonstrations of imperial authority and force being enough to mollify the majority of the outraged populace's complaints. There were a few regions and a few worlds that needed direct military intervention, but largely these were simply just loyal imperial citizens that had been pushed too far. Inquisitorial investigations after the fact also came to this conclusion. There appeared to be no active chaos, conspiracy, or sedition in the ranks of the Kulan worlds. This was not an external force or fifth columnists, they were simply just starving, outraged citizens that saw no end to the deprivations. There were, however, some worlds in the Sabbat worlds, closer to the Kulan sector now than the front line, who had been infiltrated by chaos cults, or chaos cults who had simply gone by unnoticed during the initial liberation of those planets. This did make many Inquisitors suspect that some of the sneakier Archons had been planning some sort of undermining campaign that would probably have been launched into the Kulan worlds later on. It may very well be that this had been a grand plan discovered too early by the Imperium and destroyed before it could really take root, as if chaos cults began to spread in the Kulan worlds, taking advantage of major increases in public unrest. Well, that wouldn't just be decapitating the Crusade, it would be more like bifurcating it, with rather rapid and disastrous consequences. But again, luckily, Slaydo had done a good job during the Kulan Wars, and there didn't appear to be any remnants of anti-imperial forces in the sector. An equally almost disastrous action, by the way, was that on Orestes. This was an example of the Hedwak growing a lot more brave and bold, as they launched an attack upon a major Mechanicus Forge world, that being Orestes. This would normally have been utterly unimaginable for mere Chaos Raiders, but these had brought with them not only significant ground forces, but Titans as well. The only reason Orestes was able to resist this clearly pre-planned massive invasion was, well, by pure chance. You see, a Titan Legion, Legio Invicta, was on the way towards the primary front, and it had just so happened to stop by Orestes for a little bit of maintenance and preparation before they joined the Warmaster. They were under strict orders to head directly to the primary front without allowing anything to waylay them, but, entire formations of Chaos Titans landing all around you, it's the kind of distraction that you can't really ignore, even if you would desperately like to do so. And thus, the Titan Legion marched to war in a major engine engagement, which they fortunately won. Otherwise, Makaroth would not only have been down a Titan Legion, which would have been bad enough, but also a major forge world, looted of all of its resources and its weapons. Not to mention, the Hedwak fleet that had attacked this planet had clearly been incredibly well organized. and was already doing some pretty ballsy nonsense. If they had actually been successful in looting the enormous quantities of armor and specialized weapons on the planet, well, let's just say that the Imperium supply lines would have been significantly more heavily pressed had they succeeded. So, the situation overall then of the Imperial Crusade was one of a tired but still standing strong boxer. The Crusade had taken a severe beating and had nearly been defeated, but it had rallied. It had broken the enemy's main weapons against it, and now it was simply a question of marshalling all of its strengths to fully secure the advantage that it had purchased at significant cost. But the question remained if the Crusade actually had the strength to rally, and whether or not it could do so effectively whilst continuing the fight against chaos. So far it appeared as if it could, as even though casualties were mounting disturbingly rapidly in certain areas, the new influx of troops appeared to be handling themselves relatively well, whilst stiffened up effectively by veteran Imperial Guard units. And just such a scenario will be the primary focus of our next episode, where we will return once more to Ibrahim Gaunt and not the Tarnith first and only, but rather Colonel Wilder's 81st 1st Belladon Recon Regiment. Until then, I have been Arch. Thank you very much for listening, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.